Hello everyone and welcome back to Uncertain Release. Today we're not going to talk about a camera in particular or a lens in particular. We're going to talk about the whole camera system and more importantly in lens mounts and the cameras and lenses that are associated with it. And this is the Nikon F mount system. So why the F mount system to begin with? Firstly, I'm quite familiar with it, so I think I can speak about it without too much errors and misconceptions about it. And second, I think it's a very interesting camera system because it's a lens mount that has been introduced very early in what I would call, the modern photography days. Not digital, but with SLR cameras and more, accessible photography medium compared to what was before with the Leica cameras dominating the market in the 1940s and 50s, for example. So it's a very early lens mount that has, not been replaced until the mirrorless days. So it's a lens mount that has a ton of cameras available for it and also has a ton of lenses. But being on so many different generations of technology when it comes to lenses and cameras, there is a lot of different standards, I would say, when it comes to Nikon cameras and Nikon lenses, and I would talk about that today because it can be quite confusing and there is quite a lot of information to be told here. So I'm gonna divide this video into two parts. I'm gonna first talk about the lens formats because I'm mostly going to talk about using Nikon F mount lenses on digital Nikon F mount cameras because that's what I know. I have used some Nikon F mount film cameras, but I've only used one and I haven't really used it that much, so I do not feel comfortable talking about those ones, but there is a ton of options, and I'm sure there is a ton of videos talking about Nikon F mount film cameras. So let's start with the beginning of the so I'm going to talk about the lenses first and how you can adapt them to digital, and then I'm going to talk about the cameras and more specifically which cameras are compatible with which lenses. Okay? Alright, so let's start with the lenses, and we'll start with the beginning. The lens mount was introduced in 1959, and back then there was no call sign, I would say, for these lenses. They were just F-mount lenses and there was nothing to it. It was introduced with an original Nikon F camera and it continued with the F2, and the way that those lenses were doing metering was specifically with the F2. It was with a fork on the where's my lens? It was with a fork on the aperture ring right there. It would catch a little pole on the camera, and it was very fiddly. It was not very practical. So Nikon decided to introduce a new standard for metering because one of the limitations of the Nikon F mount is that the aperture is kept wide open because of a thing that I call the aperture lever inside the lens mount. I don't know if there is an official designation for it, that's just how I call it. And the aperture lever keeps the lens wide open even if you stop it down. And that was made for focusing purposes. The wider the lens is, the shallower the depth of field is, and the more effective your focusing is when you are manually focusing with a focusing screen. And it also, for more modern cameras with autofocus, it also helps with focusing because it's also easier for the autofocus detector to do the phase detection thing. So that's one of the limitations, but the biggest limitation back then was the fact that there was no electronic in the lenses, so there was no way for the camera light meter to know if the lens was stopped down or not, and that led to the introduction of the AI ring and the AI lenses. AI is for aperture indexing, not artificial intelligence, of course. So what is an AI ring? An AI ring is a thing around the lens mount, like this is Nikon FE, right? And you have that thing around the lens mount that turns, right? With a little prong going out of it. This thing is connected to an indent on previous lenses. This thing was like just a whole circle around the lens, and on AI lenses and later AIS lenses as well. Come on, where is the... okay, focusing, please. You have a little indent here, okay, that moves with the aperturing, and that indent connects on the prong on the AI ring on the camera. And that way, the camera has a way of knowing if you are stopped down by 1, 2, 3, 4 stops and then overexpose that amount of stops compared to what the light meter is telling the camera. So that allows for semi-automated modes. At least for AI lenses, you have the ability to use aperture priority with those lenses, and those were called the AI lenses, and the previous lenses were called the pre-AI or non-AI. What is the little deciding factor between the two is really the fact is your camera equipped with an AI ring, and if it is, then you are only compatible with AI and later. If it's not, you can use pre-AI lenses without the fear of breaking anything. There is some F-mount cameras that have an AI ring and are still compatible with pre- and non-AI lenses, like this Nikon F, for example. The only digital camera that has this kind of feature, where you can push the thing. Here you have a little button on the AI ring, you push that and you can lift up the prong. And this, I think the only F-mount digital camera that is compatible with this, that has this feature, is the Nikon DF. And this is a fairly niche and expensive camera, so I'm not sure if it's a camera that everybody wants to buy, but anyway. So those are the AI lenses, and they do not have any connection to the camera. If your camera doesn't have an AI ring, it will not have metering, which is definitely a problem for a lot of time. For example, that D60 here doesn't have an AI ring, and in this matter that means that if I put an AI lens on it, I will be able to shoot, I will be able to control my aperture with the aperture ring, but I will not be able to know what the light meter is telling me, so that's a bit of a problem. It's a bit of a challenge too, but I think it's a necessary complication in your photography process. Alright, moving on. Very simple. I need to get the only lens that I have with this standard. There is a small variation of the AI standard, which is the AIS standard. And basically, if you are adapting AIS lenses to digital cameras, there is functionally no difference between AIS and AI. However, there is small differences for people that are going to be using these lenses for AIS compatible cameras, which have program mode on top of aperture priority. So those lenses will have a little indent, a little groove in the lens mount about here. So there is a contact pin on the lens mount that will depress if this is present and will tell the camera that the lens is compatible with program mode. What does that mean? I don't know. I never used a camera that has program mode. I don't know how the aperture is controlled. I just don't know that some AIS lenses have an additional tab on the lens mount, which means that maybe there is a way for the camera to control the aperture automatically. I honestly don't know. I'm not going to go too far into it, but if you just want to know what's the difference between AIS and AI, if you are using the digital cameras, there is functionally none. Okay, now let's move on to what I think is one of the most interesting areas of the Nikon F mount lenses, and that's the AFD lenses. So these lenses were made to be in a transition era. They were using autofocus technology that was very early, so that meant a lot of brands did that at that time, except Canon, which went with the EF mount and stuff like that. But basically, the motor to drive the focusing lenses in the lens is in the camera and not in the lens. And you need a focusing motor. I already talked about this in the D700 review, in the DTRH review, and even in the D60 review, but basically if you don't have that autofocus motor, you will be limited to only do manual focus. But the huge difference that those lenses have is that they have electronics in them. So even if you don't have an AI ring on your camera, you will be able to have metering, you will be able to have precise aperture control. Yes, you will be limited to manual focusing, but at least you will be able to use the lens like a manual lens with normal metering and aperture priority mode and stuff like that. So that's always pretty nice, I think. And when I was saying that those lenses were in a transition era, basically that means that they are compatible with all Nikon cameras, technically. Even the cameras that don't have the features that would make them work fully. So, what do I mean by that? If I take, like, I'm gonna take 3 Nikon cameras to show that thing. I'm gonna take a Nikon camera with a digital Nikon camera, APS-C, no focusing motor, no AI ring. I'm gonna take a full-fledged Nikon digital camera, which is a D700 with an AI ring and a focus motor, and I'm gonna take a very old Nikon camera, which is the camera that I have already shown, which is Nikon FE, which has an AI ring but no electronics for the lens control, and it's a almost fully mechanical SLR camera. And this is the only AFD lens I own. This is a Tokina 80-200. What the AFD standards means, it means that it should be able to be compatible with all of them. So I can put that lens on the D60. It will not have autofocusing because it does not have an autofocus motor, but I will be able to have metering and to have a precise control of the aperture. If I want to put that on the D700, I will have full compatibility with the lens, with the focus motor, and you know, it will cover the sensor because it's meant to be mounted on film and digital bodies, so it's always a full-frame image circle. And then finally, for the Nikon FE, I can put that on the camera because I have an aperture ring with the AI indent, so I'm able to have full metering, correct metering, and I have a focus clutch, and I can do full manual focusing, zooming, and metering with the aperture ring, and it's fully compatible with the FE as well. I don't have autofocus, just like on the D60, because this camera doesn't have autofocus at all, but you see that it's a lens that is supposed to be compatible with everything. And this is why I think the AFD system is really, really interesting, because that means that if you are shooting both digital and film, you can like get a digital Nikon camera that is compatible with the AFD lenses, and there is quite a few cameras that are. I'm going to make a list at the end of the video. And you can get a film camera, whatever the film camera is, except maybe the F2 or the F, like as long as it is AI compatible, so starting with the, you know, FE, FM2, these kind of cameras. And you can use the same lenses on both. You don't have to get different lenses for the digital camera and different lenses for the film camera. You can use both systems with the same array of lenses, which is, I think, pretty cool. But that's about it when it comes to, you know, AFD lenses. There is a lot of them, there is a lot of variations. When it comes to third-party lenses, I didn't really talk about it too much when it comes to AI and AIS lenses, but typically this is a Vivitar 28mm f2.8, and this is compliant with the AI standard and not the AIS standard. It's marked at the bottom of the lens. This Tokina, which I just shown you, is compliant with the AFD standard, so that means full frame, has the aperture ring, has the AIS compatibility things, and has a porthole with a screwdriver system for the focus motor inside the cameras. And that means that you don't have to worry about any kind of, you know, lens format, image circles, compatibility and stuff like that. Now, that all changes with the next lens standard, which is the AFS. AFS is basically the modern interpretation of Nikon when it comes to lenses. they wanted to really take a jab at Canon EF mount lenses, so that means that the lens is a lot more modern looking, like you can see. There is no aperturing at all, it's all controlled on the camera now. You still have, like, it's not a focus clutch, some lenses have a focus clutch, but you still have full mechanical control of the focus as well as all focus inside the lens. So that means that if I put that 50mm lens on my D60, I will have not only full aperture control, but I will also have full autofocus. So, you know, that removes the need for an internal focus motor in the camera. Now, what are the limitations of AFS? Well, those lenses were designed for digital, and just digital cameras. Some film cameras are still compatible with AFS lenses, like the F5, the F100, but those are like pretty high-end, late Nikon film cameras. I'm not going to dwell too much about it because again, I don't have much experience with them. But the thing that is to, you know, remember here is the fact that those lenses were meant for digital. Now, the problem with that is that on digital in the early 2000s, Nikon had several types of cameras and mostly APS-C cameras. They didn't have any full-frame cameras until 2007. So that means that all the lenses that were released before were potentially only going to be used on APS-C cameras, or what Nikon calls them DX cameras. So that meant that Nikon introduced another type of lens, which is the DX AFS lens. That lens, if the camera can focus on it, thank you, that lens is an APS-C lens, meaning the image circle will not cover a full-frame sensor, so it will not cover a full-frame, you know, 35mm film, it will not cover a full-frame sensor. It is meant for APS-C cameras. And since, you know, those lenses have internal focus motors and are fully electronically controlled, that means that Nikon could get away with introducing cameras like the D60, which doesn't have an AI ring, doesn't have an internal focus motor, but would still be compatible with some of the lenses around. Now, this is a bit of a confusing part about the Nikon way of doing, you know, format designation for sensors, so I'm just going to go with badges, okay? Nikon puts badges on their products. They put they have two kinds of sensor formats. APS-C, they call it DX, and full frame, they call it FX. The cameras that are compatible with every lens format will be devoid of any badge, and same goes for lenses that will be compatible with any camera. So, a lens that is compatible with any camera is a lens that will cover a full-frame sensor, because if it can cover a full-frame sensor, it will be able to cover an APS-C sensor as well. So that's why this AFS Nikon 50mm f1.8, which is technically an FX lens, doesn't have any badge on it, because it doesn't need to. However, this 35mm f1.8G, which is an APS-C lens, has a big DX badge on it, as you can see. At the same time, this Nikon D60, which is an APS-C camera, is compatible with both FX and DX lenses. So since it's compatible with every lenses, it doesn't have a badge anywhere. On the other hand, the D700, which is a full-frame camera, will not be compatible with the DX lenses. So, as a result, it has a little FX badge at the bottom here. What does that mean? If your camera and lens have one badge between the two of them, it's good. If there is zero badge, it's good. If there is two badges, you have a problem, or you have limitations. Basically, that's my memory thing to go about it. But yeah, basically don't put a DX lens on an FX camera unless you know what you're doing, unless you really know what the lens is. But then we need to talk about third party. And third party is a whole other pair of things, because they wanted to have the good things without the bad things of the AFS standard. And that comes to bite us, the consumer, in the ass later. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, autofocus through the AFD standard of the screwdriver thing means that the the mechanism and the development and research is going to be a lot more on the camera than the lens. And so you don't have to develop a new technology to have in-lens focus motors and stuff like that. You can just rely on the camera's autofocus, just put a helicoid with a screw and you're done. But at the same time, you don't want your lens to be looking like a thing of the past. You don't want your lens to be super old looking, so you will take the cues from the AFS standard, removing the aperturing and stuff like that, and have different, and to save even more money, maybe you will make DX specific lenses only covering APS-C sensors. Such a lens exists in the form of this, for example, this Tokina 12-24. So from an exterior perspective, this lens looks like a pretty nice digital lens, right? It has 12-24, it's a constant f4 aperture, it doesn't have an AI ring, and there is the mention of DX on it, meaning that it's an APS-C lens. So you assume that it's going to be compatible with your DX camera, and it's going to be compatible maybe with other cameras that don't have focusing motors and stuff like that, but no. Beneath that lens, that pretty face, there is an AFD lens, because if we look at the bottom of the lens, we have missing contacts. That would be for autofocus drive here, and we have a porthole for screw drive, meaning this lens requires a focus motor. And since it doesn't, so it's compliant kinda to the AFD standard, but it's also not, because it's not a full-frame lens. It's not compatible with older Nikon cameras because it doesn't have an aperture ring. It's not compliant with the AFD standard. It's not compliant with the AFS standard. It's just a bit of a mess. And those examples are actually plenty. There is a lot of lenses that the lens makers just wanted to save money. It was a Nikon. It was a design made for Nikon cameras, so they thought that they could just save money by putting the screwdriver autofocus, but at the same time it's just created a lot of confusion, and that's a little bit of a dick move in my opinion. Okay, so Tokina is one thing, there is other lens makers, and the designation for those lens makers when it comes to full frame and APS-C lenses is a little bit different. Tokina went to the Nikon way, meaning that APS-C is DX, full frame is FX, and they kept that for the Nikon lenses, but also for the Canon EF lenses, bringing the confusion there, if that wasn't enough. And yeah, so that's what they did. The other lens makers, I'm just going to talk about the principal lens makers for third party here, so Sigma and Tamron, they also had their own way of saying if it was a DX or an FX lens, and they wanted to go brand agnostic, and sometimes it just created more confusion, especially for Tamron. Sigma, if it's an APS-C lens, you will have the DC in the name. If it's DC, it's an APS-C. If there is no DC in the name, it's full frame. That's pretty easy to understand. But for Tamron, it's a little bit more different. Like, if the lens has DI in the name, it's a full-frame SLR lens. If it has DI2, if it's an APS-C SLR lens. And if it has DI3, it's lens made for mirrorless. But there is no mention of APS-C or full-frame, so it's a bit confusing. If you're looking for APS-C, just look at DI2. If you're just looking for full-frame SLR lenses, just look at DI. If you see DI3, that's for mirrorless, basically. So yeah, these third-party brands still have a bit of work to do to make things less confusing, I think, for the product names and designation and stuff like that. So that was the AFS standard, which is really a mess. Okay. Now let's talk about the last Nikon standard for lenses, which is the AFP lenses. The AFP lenses are really in the same vein of the AFS lenses, meaning that they were made for digital cameras. There was DX and FX options in the AFP standard, and the most major difference, I would say, between those two, between the AFS and the AFP use faster focus motors, and it resulted in an inability to have a linkage between the focus ring and the autofocus motors themselves. So all the focusing, the manual focusing, is focused by a wire. When it comes to Nikon cameras, not all Nikon cameras are compatible with AFP lenses. I will link a list in the description because it's way too long to enumerate what cameras are fully compatible, partially compatible, not compatible with AFP lenses, and it's just a mess. So I'm just going to leave that in the bottom of the description. And yeah, honestly, it is just an update on AFS lenses. Sometimes AFS lenses are softer than their AFP counterparts. I'm thinking in particular of the 7300 FX lens. For the AFS system, it's like way softer than the AFP version. And honestly, there is not that much difference between those lenses when it comes to the functionalities, but when it comes to adapting later, that's another pair of problems that we have, because focus by wire means that we can't control the focus if we're using a dumb adapter. Okay, that was all for the lenses. Now let's move on to the cameras. So, for the cameras, actually it's pretty easy, it's not too complicated. The real complicated part comes from where Nikon was not making any full-frame digital cameras, so before 2007. So let's head into it and look at our options. So first of all, let's put down something. If you are using a full-frame Nikon DSLR camera, Nikon considers that this is a pretty high-end camera, even though this is the bottom of the full-frame range. So even though you might have something like a Nikon D600 or Nikon D750, you will have full compatibility with AFP lenses, AFS lenses, AFD lenses, and AI lenses, because you will have the focus motor and the AI ring on the lens. And most of them are also compatible with AFP lenses, even some of the first full-frame cameras like this D700. Technically, it's partially compatible with AFP. The only limitation is that when you turn on and off the camera, the focus will reset, while on other cameras it will not. So if you are, for example, trying to save on battery and you're turning off the camera, the focus will reset before the camera turning off. So if you just want to shoot at things and you want to save the battery, it would be an annoyance, but for most people it should not be, because these lenses are pretty fast for focusing anyway. So that's the only limitation there is with the D700, for example, which is the second oldest full-frame Nikon camera, so honestly that's not too big of an issue, if I say so myself. The limitation that we would start to see are going to be for the APS-C stuff, because it's a little bit more complicated. So if we're looking at like true flagship stuff, like the D1, D1X, D1H, D2H, D2X, and the S variants of the D2H and X, those cameras have full, feature set. They have the eye ring and the focus motor, full stop. Now for the semi-professional cameras, like just below, for the D1 generation, I think it was a D100, this camera only has the focus motor but not the eye ring. For the D2 generation, it was another kind of camera. It was much more professionally built and stuff like that, and in that regard, the D200 has the eye ring and the focus motor, making it actually a pretty good value if you go watch the D60 review. Same thing goes for the D300, which has AI ring and focus motor, also the D300S, and also the much later released D500 also has that. Now, when it comes to cameras that are not semi-professional but are just like mid-range to high-end cameras, it's a little bit more complicated. So there is only two cameras that have both the AI ring and the focus motor that are not semi-professional cameras. Those three, not two. I'm saying two because two of them are almost identical. So those three cameras are the D7000, the D7100 and the D7200. D7100 and D7200 being actually pretty similar. D7200 being just a D7100 with a deeper buffer, basically. A few other tweaks and stuff like that, but basically same sensor, same autofocus system, same body design. So pretty much the same camera. And then there will be what I would say mid-range to high-end cameras that are equipped with focus motors but not the AI ring. So it would start with the D50 that has just a focus motor, then the D70, D70S, D80, D90, and then the very last was the D7500, which actually this was kind of a case of crippled hammer. Nikon pulled a Canon on that camera. Basically the D7500 was supposed to be the successor of the D7200, which had both of those things, but they feared that the D7500 having the same sensor and I think a very similar autofocus system as the D500, they feared that it would cannibalize the sales of the D500, which was like a very anticipated camera. And since Nikon studios have been lacking a semi-professional camera in the APS-C range for years, because the D300S was like much older than the D7200, for example. Well, people were there was kind of a habit to go for the D7000 series instead of the D300S and stuff like that. So they feared that it would do the same with the D500, like just not go for the D500 and to go for the 7500. So they crippled the camera, they removed the card slot, they removed the AI ring, and that's the two things they removed that really made the D500 more worth it. So that's a bit of a weird case because it's still a pretty high-end camera in my opinion. But anyway, that's besides the point. So the camera I talked about here have the focus motor and will be compatible with AFD lenses, but will not be compatible, at least not with the metering, with AI lenses. You can put pre-AI lenses on them without breaking anything, because if you do put pre-AI lenses on any Nikon camera that I've talked before that have the AI ring, you will break the plastic prong of the AI ring, which is a problem. Some of the pre-AI lenses have been converted, but just as a safe measure, either look for it specifically or just like get an AI lens. It's generally cheaper and just as good anyway, so way to go. And then there's the cameras that have neither the focus motor or the AI ring. And I touched about that subject a little bit in the D60 review, but these cameras are generally entry-level cameras. It started with the D40, then D40X, then D60, and then it was the whole D3000 line and D5000 line. None of those cameras, even though the D5000 is supposed to be a kind of a mid-range camera, well, it never had neither the AI ring or the autofocus motor, which is limiting to only AFS and AFD lenses, and AFP lenses, which is kind of a shame. You can put, as I said, AFD lenses on there and have metering and stuff like that, but will not have the autofocus capability, which is, I think, a bit limiting, too limiting, in fact, for me to recommend getting AFD lenses with your camera devoid of an autofocus motor, but that's just me. And actually, that's about it. There is all there is to say about Nikon DSLR cameras. Now let's talk about adapting to mirrorless. And adapting Nikon lenses to mirrorless is actually pretty easy. Not with full capabilities, though. You will need, if you are not bothered about autofocus and you just want to put your lens, use manual focus and have a basic control of the aperture, this is probably one of the best systems to do it, because thanks to the aperture lever in the lens mount, that means that we have a little tab at the bottom of the lens. Here, I will open up, can I show it to you? I will open up the aperture like so, okay? And this is mechanical, so you can have, like, if you want to adapt Nikon lenses, there is two types of dumb adapters. There is just the Nikon F to whatever your lens mount is, and there is the Nikon F to your lens mount, which is generally labeled G-type. G-type is referencing to the naming scheme of those AFS lenses, which generally end up by a G. This is an AFS Nikon 50mm f1.8 G, and this is a 55-200 G, and etc. You get the point. So those lenses are the G lenses, and the adapter is the G-type adapter. And what this adapter will have is an additional ring on it, like that will move a little thing that will push the aperture tab on the lens. And so if I do this and I do that, you can see I can open up and close the lens. And this is a nice example of adapting SLR lenses to mirrorless cameras and still have control of the aperture and focusing, because it's AFS lenses. Of course, if you want to use AFB lenses with dumb adapters, it will not work, because it's all focused by a wire. You will be able to control the aperture on some of them. Some third-party lenses were made to go for both Canon and Nikon, and the development process started on Canon. So typically I have this Sigma 100-400 here, and that lens doesn't have an aperture tab at the bottom. It's all controlled electronically inside the lens, and that's a bit of a shame, I would say, because it makes it completely not compatible with dumb adapters. So if you want to adapt, just get a G-type adapter. It will still be compatible with all the AI stuff lenses and the AFD stuff lenses, which have a correct aperturing to control the aperture to like pretty specific values. But the AFS lenses will still be compatible, and that's a good versatile adapter to go with. Now, if you want smart adapters, there isn't a lot of options. Like I know for Canon EF, there is pretty much an adapter for EF lenses to whatever the lens mount is. There is Micro Four Thirds, Fujifilm X, Sony E, Nikon Z even. Like, there is a lot of smart adapters for Canon EF, but for Nikon F mount, due to that mechanical thing with the adapter, with the lenses, sorry, it means that the mechanical design is much more complex, and then a lot less brands just go that way. So, to my knowledge, there is only 4 adapters, smart adapters, actually 5, but there is 2 that are very similar, that can adapt Nikon F mount lenses with autofocus and aperture control to a mirrorless digital camera. The first one is actually pretty logical. That's the Nikon Z FTZ adapter to adapt F mount lenses to Z mount cameras. And this adapter basically was kind of a necessity for Nikon to make, because they didn't have a lot of Z mount lenses when they started, and they wanted to do the same thing Canon did with their EF to RF adapter, like having that legacy glass being like a budget option for people having RF cameras. Nikon wanted to do the same thing with Z mount, so they needed to have that FTZ adapter. It was a necessity. Now, for the other brands, there is an adapter for Fujifilm, which I've bought, which is a Fringer NF-FX adapter, and it's I'm planning on doing a review on it. I'm still in the testing phase. Now, for other lens mounts, I haven't been able to find any Nikon F mount to Canon RF cameras for example, but I've been able to find 2 adapters for Sony E mount. There is a PhotoDiox Pro something, the name is super long, and the adapter, looking at the reviews, the adapter seems to be very unreliable and very slow focusing, which is a problem, of course. And it's super expensive as well. It's like almost $500 where I live, which is expensive as heck. There is also the Viltrox, I think it's NFE1 adapter, which is in the same boat as the PhotoDiox. It has the same grade on Amazon, for example. And people are saying it's not really reliable when it comes to autofocus. It's not that fast focusing with Sony cameras, but it's mostly lens dependent. Some lenses work well, some lenses don't. It's a bit weird. But at least it's like half the price and same reviews. So if you are on Sony E and want to adapt Nikon F mount lenses, just go with the Viltrox one. I think it's a safer bet than the PhotoDiox one, just because of the price. There is another Fringer adapter, which is to adapt to Contax G or something. No, I'm mistaking myself. It's to adapt to Fujifilm GFX. So the same autofocus protocols than the FX adapter. So the Fuji X mount adapter. So that was a given. Some Nikon F mount lenses have an image circle that can cover the 44x33 sensor in the GFX line, so that makes sense. But those are the only adapters. Now, what are these adapters able to adapt? It's actually pretty limited as well. It's kind of like having a camera like this. You don't have access to AFD autofocus. You don't have the AI ring, but at least these adapters are smart enough to put the aperture level down on the side, meaning that you are able to close down the lens, and since it's a mirrorless system, you are still able to have metering. So it's kind of compatible, but you don't have the same kind of compatibility with the focal length and the aperture data into the EXIF data in the like you can get with the Nikon DSLR cameras, for example. So it's more compatible than those ones for sure, but at the same time not really. It's kind of a weird thing. And it's compatible though with AFS and AFP lenses, and third-party lenses that are compliant with either AFS or AFP. For example, my Tokina 12-24 doesn't have autofocus because it requires a focus motor that the adapter doesn't have. Now, those adapters are a little bit of a pain in the ass because generally they are big, okay? They require that kind of thing at the bottom of it to house the motor for the aperture lever, which is definitely something that takes space, and like, especially on cameras, on small mirrorless cameras like the Fujifilm ones. I'm going to show you that on an X-T2 right there. Like, look at how far down that goes under the camera. That can be an impromptu tripod foot or whatever, but it's a little bit weird, to be honest. So for adapting Nikon F, if you don't want to have autofocus, it's one of the best systems to adapt. If you want to have autofocus, I would say it's a weird system to adapt, and there is not a lot of adapters for mirrorless, except if you're using Nikon Z cameras. Now, would I recommend the Nikon F mount system to someone starting out? I would say probably yes, if they are okay with DSLR cameras. If they are okay with DSLR cameras, I would just recommend them to pick whatever full frame is in their budget, and then they have the access to like a humongous amount of Nikon F mount lenses that are fully compatible with the camera. If you want to adapt this on, if you are just looking at a very big lens system that would be compatible with your camera through an adapter on mirrorless, for example, because you can't, like for example for Fujifilm, I bought that 100-400 with that smart adapter because that was still half the price of a Fujifilm lens of 100-400. So there is kind of that, you know, argument of SLR glass is cheaper, so you can cheap out and getting an older lens that will do the same thing, and so far it does. But I would not recommend the F mount for that. I would just recommend the EF, the Canon EF mount to do that. I would not recommend going into Nikon if you don't have Nikon cameras or lenses already. I did have Nikon lenses already, I didn't have Nikon cameras, so it made sense for me, and I think it's a wonderful system if you are okay with those lenses and cameras. But if you are just working to build your own, you know, kit, and you're looking at cheap glass and stuff like that, I think Canon EF is a better bet, and yeah, that's just my recommendation. Okay, so that pretty much concludes the video. I hope I helped you choosing the camera or the lenses that you wanted to get, or if I confirmed what you already knew. But I think the F-mount system is a wonderful lens and camera system that can be very versatile and sometimes budget conscious for a lot of people, and I think it's a bit too confusing for its own good. So I wanted to make that video to clear things out and maybe help people that are a bit lost in this, like I was. Okay, so that's about it. I hope that you liked the video. If you didn't, make sure to tell me if I can fix something, anything in those videos. And on that note, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!